And I may, as I'm facilitating, have to cut people off at times, and I'm only doing that just to keep us on track in terms of time and make sure that as many voices as possible get heard. My name is Parisa Norouzi. I'm the Director of Empower DC. I welcome you to the monthly meeting of the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition. I'm going to give just a very brief, I'm going to try to go as quickly as possible on some of our background. If you are new, it would be really helpful for you to let us know by indicating you can raise your hand on your, if you know how to raise your hand on your icons there, or put a thumbs up. We welcome you, new folks. Thanks for joining us. And because we often do have some folks who are new, we want to make sure that we go through some of the basics. So I'm going to do that as quickly as I can. The DC Grassroots Planning Coalition started meeting almost 3 years ago now in the spring of 2017. And we formed because we're very concerned about displacement, particularly of Black residents and communities in the city. We're very concerned about development, equitable development, deeply affordable housing, community leadership and development. And so we created this citywide coalition as a vehicle for us to learn together and to take action together, particularly around the city's comprehensive plan, but also on other related housing, planning, and development issues. Empower DC staffs the coalition, but we have a strong steering committee of members who are providing leadership. They live in various wards and parts of the city and represent different organizations, including the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless and the People for Fairness Coalition and others. Some of you know that this has been going on now for almost 3 years. So we played a big role mobilizing support for equitable development and racial equity language in the first chapter of the comp plan, which was heard by the council and passed by the council in 2018, believe it or not. It sounds like a long time ago. Then we did a lot of studying with people throughout the city in 2019. And just last November in 2020, we participated in the hearings that Phil Mendelson had on the remaining chapters of the comprehensive plan. And so just to give you a sense of our principles, where we're coming from, we're about racial justice, we're about economic justice, we want to stop displacement, we want environmental justice, we want to make sure that there's equitable access to amenities and that public needs are addressed. And we want community-driven decision-making. We want leadership from impacted people from the grassroots up. Unfortunately, in our city, we see too much developer-driven decision-making happening without a plan, without real engagement of people who have either lived in the community longest or have the most at stake. This is our agenda today. We're going to give a couple updates on where we are with the comp plan. We're going to then really talk about why are we saying the comp plan is racist? We're going to really talk about that, right? Because this is something like we've been studying this and we've come to this conclusion. You know what? This is not just benign. It's not just a little bit, yeah, it's a little weak. No, it's actually very harmful. So we're going to talk about that. We also have a guest speaker today, Pam Askew, who has 30 years of experience financing and building deeply affordable housing. She's going to give us an overview on housing development. And then we're also going to talk about how we are addressing pushing for changes in the comp plan before it's passed by the City Council. Refresher for those who are pretty new to the comp plan, it's over 1,000 pages long. It's a 20-year framework for development in the city. It sets the tone, it sets the priorities for how the city will develop, which is why it's so important. Per the law, it has to be rewritten every 20 years. The plan that the city is amending right now was written and approved in 2006. And so it actually will be rewritten, supposedly, in 2026. Everything has, the timeline has been a little messy, but a lot of us would say that the type of extensive changes that they're trying to make to the plan right now are really more like a rewrite than an amendment. And that concerns us because this was supposed to be an amendment. The plan is It's organized into different sections. There's the framework, which sets the tone, and that was actually already approved by the City Council 2 years ago. It's the first chapter. And then there are citywide elements, topics like housing, transportation, economic development. Then there are area elements, which are the neighborhood elements and refer to your communities. There's also a section on implementation, and there are maps. And we're going to talk a lot about the future land use map today. That's one of our biggest concerns. So we went over this a little bit, but the stuff highlighted is kind of where we are now. So the hearings happen in November. We had a really good showing. We probably mobilized close to 200 people for either in-person testimony or written testimony. The staff of the committee and the chairman, did confirm that we really had a good showing and helped to frame the issues. The staff, the chairman's staff person is now trying to compile all that input and come up with some of the changes to the proposed comp plan that the chairman himself, Phil Mendelson, will propose when he brings that for what's called a markup. Markup is when they literally make the changes right before they pass the bill. And that is expected in the end of February. There is a new office in DC. It's called the Council Office on Racial Equity. And through that new office, some legislation is subject to something called a racial equity impact assessment. And we spoke some at our last meeting where Phil Mendelson was actually our guest in December, that we want to see a racial equity impact assessment of the comp plan. Brian McClure, who is the director of that office, has confirmed that there will be a racial equity impact assessment. So we're looking forward to learning more about how that will take place, when it will take place. And we'll also be inviting Brian to come speak to you all. Hopefully he'll be able to do that at some point soon. For those who missed some of those past meetings, including last month where we had Chairman Mendelson with us, we do have that recorded video up on YouTube. You can go to YouTube to Empower DC's page. And if you have not looked at the comp plan or the proposals, the changes that the mayor's office is proposing, you can see all of that at plandc.dc.gov. We created a set of housing justice priorities as our framework for how we were going to advocate for changes to the comp plan, to the proposed comp plan. And we're not going to get into it in depth. We did talk about it at previous meetings, but later in the meeting, we'll talk about some of our proposed amendments, and they're based on these concepts. We want to expand rent control. We want to preserve and improve public housing. We want to house the unhoused. We want to expand rental subsidies, and we want to promote community-led equitable development. We'll send out an email after this with these links, but if you do want to read the full statement, it's available at this tiny URL, CP Housing Justice. And if you want to sign on to it, you can do that at tiny URL Housing Justice Sign On. And a number of organizations have signed on. We're really grateful for the support that we've seen. So why are we saying that the comp plan is racist, right? Well, let me tell you, we don't take that lightly, right? Like, this is not just hyperbole. It's not just to be controversial. It's something that we take really seriously, because in looking at this, we know what's been happening in the city, right? We know that there's been massive displacement. We've lost 50,000 Black residents in a short period of time. We saw a lot of development that did not seem to in any way address our needs for lower income housing. We saw communities who were completely shut out of the decision-making process. And for us, we're looking at, okay, well, how are these proposed changes to the comp plan going to change business as usual or building as usual, right? We want no more building as usual. We want to see real changes in the way that the city is approaching development, because otherwise we're going to continue to see the same outcome, which is community members displaced, communities becoming so expensive that they're exclusive now, and not having the quality of life that we all deserve because of that housing crisis. So these are in a nutshell, and we'll get into them more, but the reason why we say it's racist is because the comp plan proposed by the mayor will do nothing to stop the displacement of Black residents. because there's nothing in there that will improve the economic conditions of low-income Black residents. And that's really important to us too, right? We're not solving the poverty problem in our city. We're not repairing the harm that has been done over generations. And we can, through other modes and approaches, we can. And there's nothing in the comp plan that changes how much affordable housing will be built, especially low-income housing. Let's be clear, right? Because affordable is a term that doesn't mean much anymore, right? So we're really concerned about housing for those at the lowest income. Some people use 30% area median income, or around that range, but we don't think it's affordable if it's for families at earning $80,000 a year, right? Or earning twice the median income of the neighborhood in which it's being built, which is what we're seeing. And then we're going to talk about this last one a lot today. The proposed changes would allow developers to build more, higher and denser buildings throughout the city. But the way that they're doing it is by eliminating community input. So there will not be ANC engagement. There will not be hearings. There will not be an opportunity to create a community benefits agreement if these changes are passed as proposed. I'm going to actually skip a couple here. And to stick on this flum. So what I was just speaking to the map changes, there's a map called the Future Land Use Map, and we affectionately call it the flum. And it actually does show what type of use can this piece of land be used for in the future. If the city allows the future land use map to be changed so that the types of uses are changed, as I stated, and people are going to elaborate on this, so I won't go into it too much, it creates a domino effect. It creates a pathway for developers to build higher and denser without regard to community input, community needs, and community benefit. And it will increase the speculation. It will increase the land values and the speculation on this land throughout the city. And it will undermine community organizing efforts in communities like Ivy City, where I'll show you right here. This is Ivy City. And if you see the little piece in the middle where there's the checker, the orange lines, this is all being proposed to change the land use on the map. Well, this big section right here is the historic Alexander Crummell School that the Ivy City community, a historic Black community, has been fighting to get restored as a community center and park for 40 years. Now you see there's two pieces of land next to it that developers now, they want to take this whole city block and they want to build high density, several story. They've never come to the community for these other pieces, so we don't even know what they're proposing. But they want to get this land use change in the comp plan so that they never do have to come to the community. And that's what we're fighting, because children like these in the Ivy City community who are here standing in front of the Crummell School, which has been fenced off from the neighborhood, deserve a safe place to play. They deserve green space, fresh air. They deserve housing that their families can afford. And the proposal would actually cut them out. So now I'm going to shift over to Chris Williams, who's going to give us some similar examples of how these proposals have harmed his community in Southwest. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Parissa. We should be clear. The city is asking the public to sign off on development that it has perpetuated for the last 20 years that has had a high racial disparate impact. And so let's go through some of these examples. So what you see here on your screen is the census block containing the wharf. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the wharf, but it also contains another residential property called the Elliott that was also constructed on public land. And so we're going to walk through these two examples briefly and show you the impact. Next slide, please. You probably know the deep investments that the public made in the wharf, nearly $300 million, according to National Public Radio, the developer paid $1 for public land worth $95 million. In 2010, DC Council lowered the affordability commitments at the wharf. So there was a law in place that said deep affordability when you build a building on the wharf, and they waived that law. In waiving that law, it was likely a violation of the Fair Housing Act, since African Americans were most likely to benefit from that. In phase one, we had about 761 apartment and condo units. Now on to the Elliott. So urban renewal, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, you may not know that urban renewal lasted for so long. So the official expiration of the Southwest Urban Renewal Plan was in 1998. And once that expired, there was still land that the Redevelopment Land Agency had. And so after 2002, it began to sell off that property. And part of the property was what constituted the Elliott. And so the Elliott is an all market, so no affordable units, containing 365 units. Next slide, please. So the wharf and the Elliott came online in 2017. So you see here on the screen what happened with the population. So before that period, from 2012 to 2014, Blacks were approximately 530 in population, and only modestly went up. In fact, only went up 9%. But look at the white population. It increased 107% just for this census tract, census block containing the wharf and the Elliott. Let's look also at another example. Next slide, please. Overall in Southwest, the Black population is less numerous. In fact, approximately 500 fewer Black people in Southwest than 10 years ago, 2,500 more whites. Development in Southwest is primarily led by the district, the wharf. We also have, of course, Audi Field, or the soccer stadium, and the 4th Street corridor. So that was part of the corridor that the Elliott was on. So the district is applying downward pressure on the Black population and really facilitating this demographic shift. Let's take a look now at Navy Yard. So you may know that the district also heavily invested in Nat Stadium. So the district took out $534 million in bonds. Once you add the interest, we're talking about $1 billion stadium using public financing. We know from reports that Navy Yard has had the strongest low income displacement in Washington, D.C., if not the country, according to researchers at the University of Minnesota Law School. So the stadium was envisioned as this catalytic project that would stimulate private development. But that private development has overwhelmingly produced luxury market rate housing. But it is not just the free market acting alone. Let's look at the district's policies in Navy Yard. Next slide, please. So when the district zoned a significant portion of Navy Yard, you see it there on the maps on the left, it gave 82 acres of land the designation of a credit trade area. That allowed developers who were participating in this credit program to build at maximum height. But notice something. Notice the image on the left at the bottom, is that trade area in Navy Yard excluded inclusionary zoning. So IZ, inclusionary zoning, provides a minimum number of affordable units per development, and it's usually 8% to 12% of total square footage. But this zoning allowed them not to have to put in any affordable units. So let's see the effect. Next slide, please. The effect is that not only do we have the study from the University of Minnesota indicating the displacement of low-income populations, but we have poverty rate among Blacks increasing from 18% to 22% over a 10-year period. And for whites, which was already significantly lower than Blacks, the poverty rate for whites in Navy Yard decreased from 8% to 2%. So this is what we mean when we say the comp plan is racist. They're asking us, the public, to give them the ability to do more of the same. The last example that we will look at is regarding, next slide please, is regarding the new community initiatives. I'm sure many of you have heard of this program where the district has undertaken a public-private partnership to replace public housing with mixed income. And the public has invested over $66 million of public financing. And so we're going to look at the development known as Northwest 1. That was where the Temple Courts housing project was demolished in 2008. Next slide, please. So from 2010, so this is the, on the left, you see the census tract containing Northwest 1. And so we're going to look at it over a period of time. So the demographic changes from 2010 to 2019 saw the Black population decline over that 10-year period. The white population increased 126%. And similar to Navy Yard, we saw the Black poverty rate increase also in the census tract containing Northwest 1, and the white poverty rate decrease. And so there you see the numbers on the right. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at median household income in this tract over the last 10-year period. The $100,000 difference in income between whites and Blacks persisted in this census tract. That's astounding, given the $66 million that I mentioned earlier that we invested in the new communities initiatives, and we are simply perpetuating institutional racism. The last slide that I'll mention concerns, next slide please, concerns Greenleaf. There are efforts to replicate what was done in Northwest 1 and in other sites around the city for the next 10 years. But it's bad. It's bad for residents when you rezone these tracts because residents are cut out of the process. It is not the case that development can't proceed. But what is the case is when we do not upflum, it gives our residents and public housing more influence on what happens to their families. And so in Greenleaf, what we're seeing is that residents have already been cut out of the decision-making process. Of the 11 panelists who evaluated the final developers, one represented residents. And we see that often when the housing authority wants to build or revitalize these public housing homes, they raise the building, and then the first building they put up are the market rate building. So the market rate rent with very few affordable housing. So thank you for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to Carissa. Thank you, Carissa.
Thanks so much, Chris. You've done an amazing job laying out the crisis that we have and how these development patterns continue it. We're going to take questions in a few minutes. So if you want to put questions in the chat, we'll start looking at those. But first, I'm going to invite our friends from the Committee of 100 on the Federal City to also share a few of their observations. Nancy McWood and Meg McGuire are going to share now. Let's see if I can find them so I can, let's see. First, I'm going to stop that share. Meg or Nancy, whoever's speaking first, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and then I'll pin you.
I wanted to call to your attention the Unmasking Report. Parissa has sent this out electronically. We have maybe 5 or 6 copies that we could make available to some of you, and I'll work with Parissa to get the addresses of where we can mail those to you. This report, it's not really a report, it's an analysis of 4 of the major elements of the comp plan: land use, housing, historic preservation, urban design. And in all of these, we have listed very explicitly the kinds of changes which ought to be made in the language for the policies and the actions. And I take my hat off to Nancy McWood, who has been laboring for some months, pulling all of this together. We are using this, let me just give you a sample page here. So we have specific recommendations on language for these different policies and actions. This is helpful in guiding the council member to make very specific changes. So we've tried to identify where a lot of those verbs that have been just trashed and substituted with all of this meaningless verbiage, where they could make changes to that. I'm going to turn this over to Nancy.
Okay, thank you all. In general, what we found is a pretty effective scrubbing of policies that neighborhoods rely on to confront development. Proposals, as you all know, because Grassroots Planning Coalition has been talking about this aspect of the amendments for over a year, language has been changed to weaken or eliminate the ability of residents to rely on the comp plan to argue that a development proposal should better meet the needs of a community. The intent to ensure that some neighborhood value is followed is replaced with consideration of that value. Policies that state that another neighborhood goal must be considered is replaced with should be considered. There is just a general weakening. There are probably hundreds of policies that have been affected in that way. Longstanding policies that advise the zoning commission that there should be physical buffers, for example, between low density neighborhoods and commercial areas when taller buildings are proposed is replaced with the notion that a building's architecture is all you need to focus on. The proposed changes of words and principles that have guided development and helped to address what is often tension between neighborhoods and commercial areas will result in residents having few, if any, arguments to present to the zoning commission when they find that a development proposal is either too much or will negatively affect the community. To understand how these changes will play out, you need to look at the future land use map that Parissa talked about, the FLOM, which you are all pretty familiar with. It shows many map amendments that propose to change the use for a parcel or group of parcels, for example, from residential to add commercial. The amendments also propose changes in density from one category to another, for example, from moderate density residential to medium or high density. This matters because once this change is made on the map, the owner or the Office of Planning will ask the Zoning Commission to change the parcel's zone designation. There will be a public hearing, but the outcome is almost pro forma. The only question will be which zone will be chosen within a range of zones. For example, medium density residential could be 60 feet or it could be 90 feet allowed maximum height. Committee 100 is recommending to the council, I think Parissa is pulling up, there's the future land use map on your screen. So you can see all those little black boxes represent map amendments. And when you zoom in on it, there will be numbers attached to each one of those boxes. If you click on the box, another box will pop up that will tell you what the current zoning is, or excuse me, not zoning, but the classification, and then what the proposed change is. And you can do that for your ward. You can identify your ward or your neighborhood. There's another option on the front page before you get to the map where you can click on a boundary selection, and then it will show you both what the planning area boundary is and what the ward boundary is. And sometimes they correlate and sometimes they don't. For example, Capitol Hill, Ward 6 includes 4 planning areas, 2 entirely and 2 partially. Ward 7 is almost entirely the planning area, but not completely. What the Committee of 100 is recommending to the council is that they reject the map amendments when the proposed density change has not been discussed with the community and agreed upon in a small area plan. In some parts of the city, such as Ward 7, there are a lot of small area plans that OP references in the amendments, but OP never explains what is in the small area plan and whether the density changes are consistent with the plan recommendations. Residents and the council should carefully look at all the map amendments to see if they represent the aspirations of the community. To understand how you're, well, I've explained that if you go and you click on the black box, you will see what the proposal is for your community. You are all here at the Grassroots Planning Commission leading the way and pressing the city to confront displacement. As Parisa mentioned, more than 50,000 Black residents since 2000 have been displaced. What we found in analyzing the amendments is that in many parts of the city, displacement of Black residents and the influx of white residents directly tracked with development. The amendments barely mention displacement, and there is no clear, unambiguous policy that development can no longer lead to displacement of Black or low-income residents. We are asking council members to write new policies on displacement that are clear and directive and not open to interpretation at the Zoning Commission. The Office of Planning, as you all know, represents the amendments as necessary to provide affordable housing. If you are doing the same things that led to this crisis, we don't know how you can expect a different result. The amendments continue to emphasize new market rate housing. Affordable housing has been introduced as a subset of market rate housing, which means we will continue to get more and more expensive housing. We don't accept the trickle-down theory presented by the Office of Planning in the amendments that if you build enough expensive housing, it will lower the price of previously expensive housing to the point that housing burden residents can afford it. We think that is an unsupportable policy, to put it generously. We recommend that the amendments state affordable housing is a priority. We don't need 2/3 of new housing to be market rate. We need 2/3 to be affordable. Meg, I think we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The maps are tied to guaranteeing more affordable housing. If council approves increased densities before they change policies on affordable housing and displacement and other equity issues, and before the Zoning Commission might act on these policy changes, there could be vast amounts of new housing that will only be subject to the minimum requirements of IZ, or that 8 to 10% of the unit space of a building be set aside as affordable. It will take much less time for the Office of Planning or an owner to get approval for a zone change and a new, much more profitable matter of right project, which you cannot affect, than it will for the Zoning Commission to change the IZ law and for the Department of Housing and Community Development to write implementing regulations. How long did it take DHCD to write regs on DOPA or on the original IZ? As we saw when IZ was introduced, Developers raced to file development proposals before the IZ regs could take effect. It was years from the passage of those regs to actual implementation. But many property owners were taking no chances of being subject to its requirements. Many of these projects were far from shovel ready and were barely concepts by the time of their filings. But because they filed before the regs took effect, they were exempt from the IZ requirements. The same scenario could happen here. As Parisa explained, upzoning through changes to the FLUM will result in matter of right density increases that gives the developers what they want without any further approval. No public process, no public benefits. They will also facilitate speculation that will change land value appraisals, property taxes, could result in closed businesses, loss of jobs, and a domino effect on the property taxes and other expenses in the community. You may want to consider asking the council to also reject map amendments that aren't supported by community-led planning processes, because we first need to implement more meaningful affordable housing requirements. If evidence of community-supported density changes or more equitable policies, implementation of more equitable policies aren't good enough reasons to ask the council to suspend, we suggest a third reason, which is that we're in a pandemic that has destabilized the city. We need to figure out what jobs are left, how we rebuild our local economy, what our new priorities are, where we need to put our focus and public resources. If we decide that the only priority is to densify private land, we may be foreclosing opportunities to do things differently and respond to clear post-pandemic priorities, such as valuing land to facilitate more home ownership or to advance limited equity co-ops, buying land before it's reassessed for deeply affordable housing, expanding climate change buffers. You've discussed lots of these of innovative and modeled alternatives. Keep in mind that we will be doing this again in 2025, when the 2006 comp plan will be at the end of its 20-year cycle. That process should be quite different, with intense community engagement and the appropriateness and discussions about the appropriateness of map amendments. If the affordable housing changes and new equity policies from this amendment cycle have been approved and are being implemented, that will be a very different discussion. I don't know, I'll stop there. I don't know if Meg would like to add something.
I would just like to add a couple of thoughts here. The cumulative impacts of these different changes need to really be looked at. One thing we've heard from a council office is that, well, some of these were approved by ANCs. That may be, but did the residents really get involved with that process? Did one ANC adjacent to another ever demand that the impacts of these upflummings should be examined before they're made? I think this map is really worth spending a lot of time on with others in your community, and zero in on it, see who requested the map change, see what the density increase is, and begin to imagine, which the Office of Planning has not done, exactly what this is going to look like and how much it's going to translate into building in your community. The mayor has set this goal of 36,000 units, only 1/3 to be affordable. We think 2/3 should be affordable, but it will take an enormous amount of building through IZ, even IZ plus, to achieve this. I figured out that under current IZ, the 1,990 unit affordable housing goal for Ward 3 would result in 100 buildings of 200 units each, going up and down Connecticut and Wisconsin avenues. So begin to translate these things into something that's very visual and very clear in terms of communicating with people about the real impacts of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for both of you for your presentation, and we did send out the link to the report that they're speaking of, but we'll do it again. So if you're on this meeting and we have your email address, we'll send it again after this meeting, okay? I want to see, Caitlin is trying to monitor the chat for questions. So I'm going to ask her if she's seen any questions. We're going to move on if we have questions, we'll take a few, and then we're going to move on. There'll be more chance for discussion later. But we have a special guest joining us as well. And I did want to mention, I saw that there was one question about what could a racial equity assessment provide given the realities of what we're talking about. I think Ambrose asked that question. Brian McClure, who's the director of the Council Office on Racial Equity, is actually on this call with us right now listening. And we will be following up with him this week to learn more about what the racial equity impact assessment process will look like. I will also invite him to speak to the larger group at our meeting in February. So he's listening right now. So if anybody has any further directives or comments, I'm sure he's happy to hear that. Caitlin, did you see any questions so far?
Yeah, there's a few. The first one that's been brought up a lot is if ANCs are cut out of the process to negotiate on behalf of the community, why would they support the comp plan? And Naima had raised that early on.
Well, I think some of us probably have differing takes on that, but the question is, you know, for those ANCs who have weighed in and supported it, why would they support it if they're being cut out themselves? I think the answer is that a lot of them don't know. They don't realize that they're going to be cut out. Because I think that they become ANC because they want to be actively involved in these types of decisions. And so, yes, I think that they don't realize what the implications. I think most people don't realize what the implications are because the Office of Planning has not been honest about that. When asked, they've tried to downplay, you know, what the FLUM changes, what the map changes really mean. So that would be my answer. If anybody wants to, Nancy, you're an ANC. Do you want to add to that at all?
I think you're correct that a lot of them may not understand the sort of full implications, and particularly when it comes to the map amendments, because one council member office we heard from said that an ANC had supported some of the map amendments. And what we suggested to the council member's office is obviously you want to listen to an ANC, but you also want to look more holistically and more comprehensively at how is that going to impact maybe the next block, or maybe there are additional map amendments up and down the commercial corridor. How is that going to affect the neighborhood? You have to look at all of it. I also think some ANCs have been persuaded by groups, primarily smart growth groups, that increasing density will result in more affordable housing. And I think we've discussed that over and over again, that we need to be providing more meaningful, affordable housing, and we should not be satisfied with the 8 to 10% that is what is being proposed here. So I agree with what Parisa said. I think it's but I would, at the same time, that I don't want to suggest that we not pay attention to ANCs. I think ANCs could be asked if they've looked at some of these other broader issues.
We're going to try to just do one or two real quickly since we're a little behind our schedule. Go ahead, Caitlin.
And if there's more questions on that, I will monitor them in the chat and we'll try to make sure that we bring that back up. Another one was for council members such as, for example, Che, who critiques the strict language within the comp plan because it has prevented development projects such as the Superfresh site. How do we respond to that criticism?
This question was raised with me before the meeting as well. And so just to clarify there, I think the question is, how do we combat the perspective that appeals have actually slowed down development, or have actually prevented the development of affordable housing? And so weakening the language in the comp plan is a good thing because we don't want those appeals. I think our perspective is that to prevent the appeals, we actually need to strengthen the language in the comp plan to make it more directive, to be very clear what is required, right? And to actually enforce it. So if the comp plan says, a certain amount of housing has to be affordable, a certain type of impact study has to take place, that those things actually happen, then the community would not have no option but to appeal. And this is the reason for 90% of the appeals that it has taken place, is because communities have been ignored. In many cases, the laws have been ignored. I don't know if anybody needs to add to that.
I'm happy to talk specifically to an example in Southwest. So Coy McKinney is leading a party that is appealing a development in Southwest where they are hoping to produce 400 plus units and barely exceed IZ. This is another example. I mentioned the Elliott earlier. So it's in the same corridor. It's the same part of the same urban renewal plan where public land was then sold off once the plan expired. And for 10 years, the developer had committed to putting office buildings there because that's what the community said they wanted. But then they said, oh, no, we'd like to now switch to residential. And oh, by the way, not give you a whole lot of affordable housing. So that has actually, appealing that case has actually prevented the hardening of gentrification in Southwest. So these things are essential. We're really trying to save families and save our communities from all of this acute gentrification and displacement.
One more, Caitlin?
I'm pulling them as we go. We can do one more brief one. So there was a question about churches and basically providing avenues for churches who may have access to land to assist them with building affordable housing before developers come in and take over those spaces.
That's a great recommendation. I know it's happened in a few places in the city that churches have utilized their land in partnership with nonprofit developers to build affordable housing. And those are some of the types of solutions that we want to work on as this body, as the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition. We know that not all of the housing solutions will be in the comp plan. Some of it has to be in legislation or in policy that will accompany the comp plan. So as we go, we're learning stuff that we now want to turn into, legislative proposals that we could work on together. And I think we have many clergy that are part of our movement, and we would love to work with them to support them to sustain their congregations over time, as well as address the housing need. To that end, I'm going to suggest we are going to have more discussion later, but to that end of talking about housing development specifically, our guest is going to share a presentation with us along those lines. Pam Askew has over 2 decades experience working in affordable housing development in DC. I had the opportunity to work with her several years ago on the community-led proposal for the Cromell School. And she's going to share some of her, a little bit of like a 101 for us to understand from a developer's perspective, what it looks like to build affordable housing, and also some of the lessons learned. Pam, just let me know if you want me to do the slides or if you want to do them.
Actually, could you do them? Only because I'm having technical difficulty.
No problem. So I am going to, okay, so I'm going to pull them up and you can go ahead and start talking. And if you want to introduce anything more about yourself while I pull that up.
Sure. Again, my name is Pam Askew. I currently work at McCormick Barron Salazar, which is an organization that develops housing throughout the country and was started by Richard Barron, who was a legal aid lawyer who worked in Missouri in St. Louis to fight on behalf of the rights of public housing residents at Pruitt-Igoe. And that was over 50 years ago, which then caused him to grow and build and create McCormick Barron Salazar, where he could go in to work with housing authorities and other partners to redevelop either public housing that's in need of renovation or redevelopment and so forth. So that's where I work currently. I've been there about 2 years, and prior to that, I worked for 21 years developing affordable housing, specifically in DC. So with that, go to the next slide. So I share this picture, which I took this morning, because when I was 13, I would drive to take my sister to Union Station when she would take the train to go to college. And this building was boarded up, and there were people sleeping in front of the building who were homeless. And as a 13-year-old, that bothered me. And that's what caused me to want to pursue a career in affordable housing. Interestingly enough, 37 years later, the same building is still boarded up. So I don't know anything about the building. It makes me sad, but it shows that work still needs to be done in the District of Columbia. Next slide. So why do we need affordable housing? And go to the next slide. So this slide just shows, and forgive me, it's a couple years old, but it's really the point I'm trying to make here is that fair market rent in DC requires a certain income. And what does that mean? Fair market rent. The average rent in DC, and I've shown here what it is based on bedroom size. And if you look below, that's the area median income. That's what AMI stands for. And forgive me if everyone knows this already, so I don't mean to be too basic, but in case you don't. So all of the red font can afford the DC rents, and everything else to the left cannot afford the average DC rent. Meaning, and what does afford mean? Afford in HUD terms means 30% of your income goes to rent. So that means that people are finding housing that's probably more than that 30% of their income to rent. And the stat that was out back years ago was that over 12 million renters and homeowners were spending more than 50% of their annual income in housing. And we call that having like a housing burden, where it then how do you pay for childcare, and how do you pay for transportation costs and food and medical care and so forth? And it just really makes it quite difficult. So this shows that there's this great need for affordable housing, specifically, as Parisa has mentioned, for incomes either 0 to 30, as well as even from 30 even up to 60% of area median income. Next slide. And so the district actually has a plethora of resources for affordable housing, and not for you to be overwhelmed by the acronyms, but people in the government love acronyms. But we have DHCD, Department of Housing Community Development. We have the Housing Finance Agency. We have the Housing Authority. We have HUD that has funding. The Deputy Mayor's Office. The Department of Environment has money that I've tapped into, as well as DCSCU, which is Sustainable Energy Utility Agency, if you're doing energy efficiency upgrades and so forth. DHS has resources if you're doing permanent supportive housing, as does Department of Mental Health. So there's a lot of resources out there to do affordable housing that services the lowest of incomes. You need all of these resources, and I'll show you an example of that. Next slide. So I'm going to go through an example that I worked on called Sheridan Station. It was a new community, and that's something, I guess, the deputy mayor has a new communities initiative, and it was one of the areas considered a new communities initiative. Next slide. Sheridan Station's in Ward 8, and the story is that when Clinton would take his his car down to Andrews Air Force Base, he saw this dilapidated housing along Suitland Parkway. And his commentary was something needs to be done with that. And it was built on a hill. It's about an 85-foot drop. And so that caused a lot of plumbing and sanitary and water issues and erosion and so forth that caused a lot of plumbing problems on the first floor units and so forth. And so the Housing Authority decided to demolish it and put out for competitive bid to redevelop the site. Next slide. So this is a photo of what it looked like before. Next slide. And so we were selected, the organization I work for, to redevelop the site. We spent years working with the residents and getting an idea of what they wanted. What did they want their housing to look like? And you can see Suitland Parkway is kind of that spine through the center of the slide. And this, just to help give anyone bearings, Anacostia Metro stop is about 2 blocks away. Next slide. So this is the first phase, Sheridan Station, and it is 114 units. Of the 114 units, all serviced people at or below 60% of area median income. And I had 45 units that were set aside for replacement housing, for public housing. So it was both open to Sheridan's former Sheridan residents as well as Berry Farm residents. And I will say, this was the DC's first LEED Platinum building developed by a private developer, and it was low-income housing. And I think that's important to state because you can do it with affordable housing. This was done under the Obama administration, and there were stimulus funds available that allowed me to install my solar array. I would not have been able to do that without that stimulus funding, so much greatly appreciated. Next slide. So here just shows you the sample budget of Sheridan Phase 1. And this is freedom of information. Any applicant that applies to DHCD or the Housing Authority, this information could be garnered on any project. But you can see that building had aluminum windows because it was on a highway, Suitland Parkway. It had a brick facade. It had a lot of elements that were quite high. You know, the storefront windows to bring in light, because I wanted a lot of sunlight into the building. So to build it cost over $250,000 a unit. However, I have residents who live there, and some of them pay a third of their income in rent. And so some of them may pay $50 a month in rent. So how do I afford a $250,000 a unit building if someone is only paying $50 a month in rent? And the point of this slide is not necessarily for you to focus on all the numbers, but just look at the sources, all those different sources, you know, 9, 10 sources. And I have to pay it back through a waterfall, a cash flow waterfall, except for the low-income housing tax credit equity is the one thing I don't have to pay back. But the district subsidy, the DEMPED, sorry, I got sidetracked for something. Oh yeah, the HUD subsidy has to be paid back. That is a cash flow mortgage payment and so forth. And even the fee that the developer charged, a portion of it went back into the deal to make the numbers work. Next slide. So we did a phase 2. This was for sale. And so this was available to households who were low income or not low income. And the Housing Authority defined that on this particular deal at that time. Anything below $83,000 a year annually was low income. And what that meant was then you received a $53,000 down payment assistance that over time burned away, meaning that if you stayed in the home 15 years, you'd never have to pay it back. If you lived there 6 months and sold it, you couldn't benefit from that $53,000, you'd have to pay it back. But by offering that subsidy, and that was offered through Hope 6, which was a HUD program that enabled 2/3 of the 80 homeowner units to go to affordable households. And so that was very important to us. Next slide. Here's just an interior shot. Next slide. And then phase 3 is also rental, and this had more replacement units, both for Sheridan and Berry Farms, and then also mixed it in with affordable rental townhomes. What's important to note here is that we produced 85 jobs and continue to produce jobs for Ward 7 and 8 residents. And I had quarterly meetings with Barry Lenore at United Black Fund, who led our Sheridan Station resident council, along with residents, the Housing Authority, nonprofit stakeholders, and the like, where I reported on my jobs, the reentry criteria, who was leasing up, who was moving in, and so forth. And this is something anyone can ask for in a redevelopment effort, just for a developer to report out on these updates. What's important to you? What's their investments in LBE, SBE businesses, and so forth. Next slide. Here's again an example. Phase 3 was later on, and it was after several hurricanes where construction costs went up, and so it was more expensive. And so we needed, to raise more funds. And just to give this as an example. Next slide. So not only have I done new construction, but also renovation. And this is a building that is on Mississippi Avenue that was offered by the District of Columbia to convert this to permanent supportive housing. Next slide. It is adjacent to, oh, I'm sorry, if you could go back for a moment. It's adjacent to this property. Oh, yeah, that one, Park Vista. And this is on Mississippi Avenue and 13th Street. And this is affordable housing that I had done several years ago. And I couldn't leave that boarded up building next to Park Vista alone. So that is why I went after that building, and I wanted to produce affordable housing to very low income households. Next. And so you can keep going. Keep going. So this was, I'll share with you, it used to be a police substation. So I had ammunition closets, I had above ground storage tanks, below grade storage tanks, and we had squatters because it was vacant for 20 years. And so we renovated it. It's 19 units into permanent supportive housing. It's for formerly homeless families. And I partnered with Community of Hope because as a developer, I acknowledge I cannot do the supportive services to the level of excellence that the residents deserve. And that is why I partner with a partner like, in this case, Community of Hope. And so let's go to this, stay with the funding. So there were some unique elements about this, and I've discussed this openly with DHCD, that things that worked and things that did not work. And this was before Polly Donaldson ran DHCD. She actually was working at a nonprofit that does supportive housing as well. So a lot of these things have been remedied since using this specific development as an example. So DHCD wanted to maintain, or the district wanted to maintain ownership of this building, but they wanted the developer to take the debt. I mean, it's like buying a car where someone else owns it, but you make the car payments. It didn't make sense. And they wanted me to provide affordable housing to permanent supportive, clients and formerly homeless clients, but they didn't want to give me vouchers. The only way it works is if I receive a rental voucher where someone pays 30% of their income in rent, but then I get a difference, let's say up to $1,000, then I can pay for that loan that I took out to renovate the building. So that was something that took several years to structure and negotiate. So the district still owns the property, but the loan was taken out, but they were, the Housing Authority did give us a HAP contract, it's Section 8 contract on the property, and Department of Mental Health provided grant for the construction. That was very helpful and very seamless. Next slide. So it took us 12 months to build the property. It took me 10 months just to get PEPCO approval. So anything the district can do to help on the utility approvals would be greatly appreciated. Next slide. And then on the compliance, again, I mentioned a little bit briefly that the building was leased to the district. What's interesting is DRES, that's the agency that negotiated the ownership structure. They wanted me to indemnify if anyone on the adjacent property got harmed. Well, that can't happen because I can't control what happens to people on the adjacent property. So that took us a while to negotiate that out, but keep going. So here was a few other things is that I can typically lease up apartments, either 25, 30, I've even done 38 units a month. And this is for homeless people where they only had to pay a third of their income in rent. So it's so reasonable, so affordable, but I could only lease up on average 2.5 units a month. And in part because I had to get people had to be approved by DHS, DHCD, DC Housing Authority, and Department of Mental Health. They had to get all these approvals. And some of these people, they don't have access to birth certificates or driver's license or so forth. So that was a kind of a hiccup that, residents need to have approved residents ready to move in when they know a building is coming online. Next. So we had the Housing Authority provide a 10-year Section 8 contract. There was a hiccup though, because I have a 40-year loan. So year 11, the contract could go away. And that is a problem. And that is a risk that was just taken. And hopefully it won't go away. But that is the reality that there's some risk there. And the other thing is DHS provides funding for the supportive service agencies, in this case, Community of Hope. And their funding is annual. So if their funding goes away, I lose that support that I need for those residents. And so it'd be great if that could be a 10-year contract, a 5-year contract, or a longer term commitment, basically. Next slide. So here is just delineating kind of the roles between the developer and Community of Hope. Next slide. And then here's just a snapshot of the families that Community of Hope provided and kind of elements that they were living with. Next slide. And then here's just a list of services provided by Community of Hope. And as a developer, what I do is I build their space. And so it's no cost to them, no rent to them in the building, so that they have that connection with the residents and can have that daily interaction. Next slide. And here's just a little bit more information on the success that Community of Hope was able to achieve. Next slide. And here, and I have his permission, this was a gentleman, and he lives in the property, and he also works at Park Vista. And prior to that, he was initially living at the homeless shelter on St. Elizabeth's campus, but it became unsafe. And so he was living in the woods next to the building. And so I just approached him to see if he wanted to live at the building once it was completed. And apparently to get on the homeless wait list, you have to take a vulnerability study and you have to be on a vulnerability wait list. And I get the need for all of this, but he was living in the woods. So to me, the most vulnerable. Happy to say, got him on the list, got him into the house, and got him into the property, and working part-time at the adjacent Park Vista. So opportunity to achieve some independence. But with that, I'll pause and open. You can just close out the PowerPoint and open it up to any questions. And I'll preface it to say, I said this to Parisa, I don't have any developments right now in the District of Columbia. I'm currently working on developments in other states. So I have no interest in any property or any development in the district at this time.
Thank you so much, Pam. I really do appreciate you sharing your experience from a developer's perspective. Caitlin, I think has been monitoring the chat for questions. So let's go to Caitlin and see if we can pull a couple out for you.
Sure, thanks Pam for that. That was great. One question from within this presentation is, At Sheridan Station, and this was actually kind of answered by someone else in the chat, Dewan answered it, but if you have anything to add, that'd be great. At Sheridan Station, what public and private amenities are available in the neighborhood, such as green space, good public schools, grocery stores, eateries, etc.?
Yeah, so Sheridan Station is on Sheridan Road, and the district government specifically wanted commercial they have a Great Streets initiative, and they wanted all commercial to go along MLK. So they did not allow our zoning to have any commercial retail on the property. So that was a specific kind of element we had to follow. What we did do, we have a community health clinic that accepts anyone regardless of whether they are insured or not insured. And Dr. Gloria has been operating in Ward 8. And so she lab and a leasing center. And then there's also green space. All of those elements are for the residents and an amenity for the property. There is other green space throughout the property and a playground that we installed, and that is open to the community. I will say it is fenced in for safety, and we do lock it at night when it gets dark. So it's open to all, but closed in the evening.
Thank you. And then there's two other questions that hopefully we can get to quickly. One is something that has come up in our conversations as well to kind of combat the narrative that has come up for people pushing for the need market rate units to be able to afford to build affordable units. Is that true?
Well, so Sheridan had no market rate units, and you really have to define what's market. We talked earlier about the wharf and what that market is versus what Anacostia Metro market might be a little bit different. I did not have market in Sheridan Station phase 1 or phase 3 unless you did a market study today and they determined market is 55% of AMI, then maybe I did do market, but not in I think what the question is asking is, do I have 120% AMI or 200% AMI? I do not. But what made this deal work was I got the land for free. So I do understand if a developer says they need market rate housing, I think that's if they pay a certain price for the land. If they have opportunities to secure land and the district can give that land to the developer for free. I mean, they did it for the wharf, but, or that's what, I'm sorry, I don't know that as a fact. I think I heard that, and I'm sorry if I heard it wrong on the earlier presentation, but you don't have to have market to build deeply affordable housing, but you need subsidy. So it's a trade-off, I should say.
Thank you. And you're not wrong on that. We pretty consistently give away public land for basically nothing, but still don't get a lot of affordable housing on those sites. So that was accurate. Another question is, how many units at the Sheridan were slated for Berry Farm residents? And then relatedly, how many people applied for Sheridan phase 1 versus who actually leased up?
Great question. So it's been a while since I've worked on Sheridan. So I think the total units are 374, if I'm not mistaken. So 110 of those units, and it might be 364, so forgive me if I got that wrong, but 110 were replacement units for Berry Farm and Sheridan Station. So 45 went to Sheridan and 65 went to Berry Farm. What was interesting was people moved out of Berry Farm to Sheridan, and this was long before they had selected a developer to redevelop the site and started demolition, long before this. The Housing Authority leased Berry Farm units back up. So although it was slated for replacement units of Berry Farm, that added more units that you'd have to replace. Does that make sense? Or at least more households that you would have to provide the replacement housing for. So that was kind of an interesting dynamic, but, and I think they did that because they couldn't afford to leave the units vacant because they had to pay an operating cost to maintain the property. So I think there's some elements I don't understand, to rationalize why that was done. But that's the units. Did I answer all the questions? Berry Farm did a number of units, Sheridan and Berry Farm.
The other one was just how many applied versus who actually leased up, but I think you may have covered that.
Yeah, we actually reached out aggressively to Sheridan residents who they received vouchers to move within the district. And so some of them, it had been so many years since the property had been redeveloped. It sat vacant for a number of years, and then the Housing Authority selected a developer. We went after Hope 6, and we didn't get selected the first year. Hurricane Katrina happened, so by the third attempt, we finally got selected. And so there was a number of years that passed, and so some Sheridan residents didn't want to come back to the site. So Sheridan and Berry Farm residents had priority, and we also had additional Berry Farm and Sheridan residents come and not necessarily take those replacement units, but we had some move into the homeownership units and so forth. So that was exciting news to us. But what was interesting was on that property, that multifamily building, I had a sign now leasing, and I had over 800 names of people interested in moving in because they got that visibility on Suitland Parkway. Now, we maintain a list at the property specifically for Berry Farm and Sheridan residents. So if anyone comes in today, those units stay replacement units in perpetuity. So someone can go into the rental office today and they can show if they have any type of ID with a Berry Farm or a Sheridan address or any type of Housing Authority approved documentation that shows that they were a prior resident. They could take a unit that would come available if someone were to move out or something like that. So, and that has happened as well.
Thank you. And just to that point too, I know there was an affordable housing property that went up on Benning Road. I think it's called St. Stephen's, and there was like a 3-year wait list before it even opened because it was one of the only spaces that people could afford. So I imagine anytime there's a building like the ones that you've constructed that have access to getting affordable housing, there are like a big competition just because
yes,
it's available to many.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's such a great need for people's rent to be 0 to 30% AMI. Now, I will say this, we also have a workforce center to work with the residents to help them with their employment development as well. So their income may change along, the income bands, but as long as it's still a 30%, then it's that affordability that we're striving for. But I understand that demand, and there's not enough being built. It gets back to another point I'd like to make is that, to make this work, you would need the land for free. And what's interesting is DHCD funding gives priority to areas that do not have high concentrations of low income. So I get that as a policy, that totally makes sense, but you're not going to find free land in Tenleytown. You know what I'm saying? So there's kind of a conflicted policy there that, I just kind of put that out there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There was a question in the chat actually about a space that is becoming available in Ward 3, the Wardman Park Hotel, and if there's a possibility to maybe have that be used to convert it into affordable housing because they just filed for bankruptcy. But I am going to put a note in that, so hopefully we can follow up with you. The last question I do want to ask while we have you though, just to keep us on time, is do you think, and this is bringing us back to the comp plan and to your point about not having enough opportunities for affordable housing, do you think that increasing to like a 200 million square feet, including airspace of the maps in the comprehensive plan up Fleming is a positive for increasing the amount of affordability in the city?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. So anything that's built with government money that goes beyond 4 stories, I then have to pay Davis-Bacon heavy highway commercial wages. And so where you saw at Sheridan Station, phase 1 was $250,000 a unit. If I had to pay today's rate of heavy highway wage, if that was a 5, 6, 7 story, which gets to your question about increased density, that price might double. And that might be why the Wharf, that has 8, 9, 10-story buildings that are all glass and so forth, very expensive. I'm not sure increased density would get you more affordable housing. I do think it can, but it's not a black and white issue where it's like one or the other, because it does come with increased costs. I think you can do more affordable housing in a plethora of ways. That's just one of them. But yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't think I quite answered your question, but only just to say it's not, I don't think it's one for the other. I think I throughout my career did ask for zoning increases. For me to get my zoning increase, I had to have ANC approval. That was just part of my business practice, was to always stay in constant communication with our ANC, our ward representative, and so forth. And so that was part of the business, but increased density can be good. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure I can answer it so quickly or so easily.
I think you did a good job, Pam. I mean, I think your point about how, if you go above, did you say 4 stories, that the costs increase exponentially, so you would have to have more subsidy, and it seems to be you're already struggling to have enough subsidy to cover the 30% area median income units.
Yeah, and the other thing, just from a kind of a programming developer and someone who worked for companies that manage property, the real need is 3, 4 bedroom, large family units. You don't want to put that in a high rise. I have kids, I want my kids to be able to have green space and so forth. And so higher density is not the answer for all families and all households, right? And so that lower that lower density, that whether it's townhomes, like you saw at Sheridan Phase 4, we had more of a townhome mix because I had those larger family units. That's important that people have their individual entrances and that defensible space from kind of a policy point of view. So I add that element to the mix.
I want to thank you again, Pam, for joining us and sharing your knowledge, and we look forward to hopefully continuing to interact with you and learn from your experiences. Everybody, please give a virtual round of applause for Pam. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So what we're going to do in our last half hour is we are going to give you a snapshot of what we're working on for amendments to the comp plan that we want to be pushing forward on. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and then some of the members of the steering committee are going to present a few different amendments. This is not by no means comprehensive, like it's over 1,000 pages. We're struggling just like you are to try to get through it and come up with suggestions, but we're going to give you some highlights. And we'd also like to hopefully have enough time to hear if there's others on the call that have been working on proposed amendments to get a highlight of what you've been working on as well. So first I'm going to ask Renee Bowser to share on affordable housing. Oops, what happened here? Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to just talk about 2 amendments on what the Office of Planning, the Mayor's Office of Planning, calls affordable housing. The definition of affordable housing is perhaps the most important provision in the housing element. It shows the sleight of hand or deceptive tactics of the Office of Planning's proposed amendments. Here is where the rubber meets the road, because it defines what type of housing the district will finance for redevelopment and new construction. The way the Office of Planning writes affordable housing is any housing that they subsidize for particular income groups is affordable housing. That means if they subsidize housing for people at 120% of the family median income, or an annual income for a family of 4 of 151,000, that is affordable housing. So we're proposing that affordable housing shall be defined as housing subsidized below market rate for households within specifically characterized annual income ranges defined in the DC code based on HUD statistics for the Washington metropolitan area. And I go through them. And the point is, the phrase affordable housing must be coupled with identifying income groups for whom the referenced housing is intended for the affordability definition to be meaningful when identifying maintenance, preservation, and production. So for example, with the redevelopment of Greenleaf, if they say, let's redevelopment Greenleaf public housing, 1-for-1 public housing to 1-for-1 affordable housing, that very definition allows them to exclude the public housing residents who are there now, because public housing residents are in the 0 to 30% median family income, where 30% for a family of 4 is $37,000 annually, and they can only afford a little over $900 a month rent. So by the very definition, when the Office of Planning says replace public housing with affordable housing, they're cutting out the people in need, most in need of affordable housing. The other provision I wanted to highlight is it's policy 559, it's long-term affordability restrictions, and it's at page 49 of the housing element. The Office of Planning took out the provisions for preserving housing by public financing to be protected by long-term affordability restrictions. So we want to add, we want to say that ensure that affordable housing that are created or preserved with public financing are protected by long-term and where appropriate lifetime affordability restrictions and are monitored to prevent their transfer to non-qualifying households. And again, what the Office of Planning did said, oh, it should have long-term affordability, but making it no requirement to have long-term affordability. So this is how we see that this is a racist policy, because they're reading out of the housing of the comprehensive plan housing for those most in need of housing, which are low-income families of color. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Next, we're going to go to Reggie. And after we run through a few of these, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Reggie, you want to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All righty. So my name is Reginald Black, and one of the things that we also work together on is language in the comprehensive plan about addressing the unhoused. And we have several sort of like examples of how we want language to look in the comprehensive plan. So what you're seeing on your screen right now is the new version proposed by the Office of Planning pertaining to a facility we care about, which is the CCNV shelter, which is actually downtown in Ward 6 on 2nd Street. And this particular amendment talks about the district should prioritize services and housing for people experiencing homelessness downtown. It highlights having shelters 24 hours a day. It talks about having short-term housing for youth and people under 24, and having permanent supportive housing. Next slide. Our proposed amendment actually spells out a number of residents to be used. It talks about $10 million and $7 million. Also, it connects CCNV residents to jobs, and it must, enforce that economic justice be one of the core principles. And all of these are tied to a piece of legislation which is called the Comprehensive Plan for Services at 425 2nd Street. Residents should be adequately addressed in advance of the likely closure of this particular shelter between 2019 and 2023. And we want to make sure that these initiatives are not predicated on a possible shelter. These should be occurring anyway. And of course, it does mention the legislation and where it should be in the Central Washington element and the subsection of Downtown East. So there are several policies. You can go to the next slide. There are several policies that have to deal with economic development, things like local entrepreneurship, underused sites, innovation and economy, environmental policy for economic growth, equitable opportunities in industries, supporting emerging entrepreneurs, economy workers, supporting local entrepreneurs, innovative retail, and employee-owned and controlled businesses. You can go to the next slide. Our recommendation specifically points out that there are certain land uses that communities can use to promote economic development, where we're providing government-owned land to indigenous district residents for the creation of flea markets and farmers markets. The strategy will also allow grassroots entrepreneurs to bring produce, general merchandise services to underserved communities in the district and allow citizens to revitalize obsolete commercial areas in the city. And we're not just focusing in on just flea markets and farmers markets, but this is to expand on having more barbershops, having more tailors, having more Black-owned businesses in these corridors by using our public land to spur on that economic development. This is a very, very important piece, because when we're talking about affordable housing, and as Ms. Askew alluded to, there are funding formulas we have to account for. And this is one of the ways that we can use the comprehensive plan to promote and make sure that those economic strategies are being looked at as well. Next slide. So here is the Office of Planning's proposed housing code enforcement language, where it talks about improving enforcement codes, talking about preventing deteriorated, unsafe, and unhealthy housing conditions, especially in DC, and that tenants should be provided with information on how to obtain inspections, contest petitions for rehabilitation, and purchase multifamily buildings, also vote in conversion elections. Our particular recommendation, next slide, specifically talks about collections of fines and to make sure that we prevent the loss of low-income rental properties in neighborhoods where that particular resource is scarce, to also ensure information on tenant rights and use repair and deduct contest housing provider petitions, also purchase rental properties through the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and also use fines to set up an abatement fund to make sure that people have their repair concerns mediated. Yeah, I want to just show one more, which talks about public housing revitalization. Our language is to renovate and revitalize distressed public and assisted housing projects. It must use build first and other efforts to prevent displacement, provide for one-on-one replacement on site and in immediate surrounding. And where density is doubled, we want to make sure that the units are kept permanently affordable, and that any share of private equity in the development must be less than 50%. I'll be around for more questions on more of these. There's more of these as well, but these are just a few examples of language that we want to try to get into the comp plan to protect our unhoused residents and make sure that they can make inroads on gaining self-sufficiency and obtain housing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Reggie.
I'm turning this over to.
We're going over to Andrea now. Andrea Rosen.
Oops. Let me know if the background noise is too great for you to hear me, because I don't have any control over what's going on next door. So when effective, rent control restrains the amount and frequency with which rents can be raised from year to year, slowing runaway increases that destabilize residents. but the DC rent control law contains many loopholes that property owners have used to circumvent the law. Moreover, when the rent control law was passed in 1976, it applied to all residences that had received building permits through 1975. That is still true today. No units built since 1975 are covered. Ward 8 has the greatest number of rent-controlled units, and the differential between market rents and rent-controlled rents is greatest in Ward 4. But rent control is a stepchild in the comp plan, a stepchild that the Office of Planning would like to disavow. It makes few appearances, and where it does, the Office of Planning is lukewarm about it. Paragraph 500.5E, which is not on the screen, but I just wanted to mention it, attempts to distinguish between market rate and affordable housing. In OP's version, affordable housing is put in the, rent-controlled housing is put in the market rate column because it isn't subsidized by government and means testing isn't required for residents. This puts rent-controlled units in a very vulnerable place by the city, which has indicated it would like to shift rent-controlled units to the affordable column by imposing income limits or by subsidizing landlords in order to meet the goals it has set for producing affordable housing. But this does not add affordability in the city. It just moves the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic. In the paragraph that I'm going to address, you'll see some color coding. I've actually rewritten 10 or 11 paragraphs in the comp plan to strengthen the legitimacy of rent control as part of the affordable housing continuum, but I'll be focusing on just this one today, which is the paragraph entitled Rent Control. Oh my gosh. Okay, so what you'll see there in terms of the color coding is that, oh, it's different. Okay, somehow on this screen it looks different from what I remember, what I have on my sheet. Okay, well, basically what I've done is I've inserted things and removed things to try to give more strength to the language and to also reflect the current goals that people advocating for rent control have in the city. So in addition to maintaining rent control, we want to expand and strengthen it. We don't just want to moderate affordability, we want to preserve affordability, and not just of older rental properties, but of rental properties generally. And not just protect long-term residents and not just the elderly, but anyone who is in a rent-controlled building from unpredictable and destabilizing rent increases. So it then sort of it provides some directives for the government in terms of improving it, rent control, by advancing equity, adhering to building codes. One of the ways that landlords save money in rent-controlled buildings and also encourage people to move out is by not keeping the building up to snuff building code wise. And then they can file with the city to get a great increase in rents because they have all of this work they have to do on the building that they've allowed to crumble. Let's see. And then the firm stance that rent control must not be restructured as a subsidized housing program and commandeered to fulfill the city's myriad affordable housing obligations. That's pretty much it.
Thank you, Andrea. Wonderful job. I'm appreciative of everybody's labor on this. We have one more presenter, Chris Otten. You can unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, so racism in planning here in DC. Not only are we asking the council to reject the upplumbing, which eliminates community input, but we are asking the council to reject the mayor's weakening of existing policies. I'm not going to show you in these slides what we necessarily want, because what we want already exists. And it's been what communities around the city have used to propel appeals. Now imagine for a moment, if you are a city official and you've been around for the last 15 years and you've seen the development that has unfolded, large luxury boxes, studios, one bedrooms, unaffordable, displacing massive amounts of Black folks from the city, working people from the city, communities around the city. And then you see communities put up the red flag, put up the white flag, whatever, just say, hold on, stop. And appeal some of these really, really terrible projects and win because of some of the language in the plan. You as an official, what would you do? Well, it wouldn't be to strengthen the language. Here, as you can see on your screen, they want to weaken the language so that our only kind of way to stem the displacement in an appeals in a court, which takes a lot of work. Nobody wants to be in court, but we had to go there. We had to win. It was because of the language in the plan. So so the mayor wants to weaken the language, and we want to tell the council to reject the weakening of the language. Here's an example. Studies, they cross out preceding zoning and case approvals. They want to inform the zoning and case approvals and put language in there that says, to the extent the following factors are relevant. Well, relevant to who? Relevant to the people facing displacement, vulnerable communities around the city, or relevant to the developers, relevant to the planners who don't care about us? Notice they erase ensure that zoning case approvals such as PUDs be informed by, should be informed by. So get rid of ensure and put a should in there, right? Instead of a shall. These are the sort of things that we see throughout the plan. And we're asking you to tell the council to reject this weakening of the plan language. The other policy, this is all from chapter 25 of the comp plan. It's the implementation element. It's where really the rubber hits the road in terms of planning. And it specifically tells the Board of Zoning Adjustment, you can see in policy IM-1.3.3, this plan tells the Board of Zoning Adjustment, the Zoning Commission, the Zoning Administrator, and other district agencies to require consultation with this plan before making its decisions. Well, what does the mayor do? Sends to the council language that eliminates, requires, should. You'll notice should is in here now, when required by law or regulation. They have done this throughout the plan. The weakening of the language throughout the plan is a very clear example of racism in planning here in the District of Columbia. So instead of listening to the people who have taken the time to actually file appeals and the hundreds of hours of work that goes into that, to just say, hey, your laws say this, protect us from this massive amount of luxury development that's displacing us. Instead of saying, you're right, it's in our laws, the city officials, the mayor, the Office of Planning have gone about to weaken the language. That is racism in planning. We're asking you to tell the council to reject the weakening of the language. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So we're going to open it up for a couple minutes of discussion. As we get your questions in the chat, I want to highlight that we are trying in the next week or so, by the end of the month, to finalize the proposals that we're going to be pushing at the City Council. We are going to submit them to Chairman Mendelson, and hopefully he will accept some of them as his own. We've also reached out to the council offices to request meetings with the council members or their staff the first week of February. If you would like to be part of those meetings, particularly for your ward, please let us know. You can email compplan@empowerdc.org to let us know that you want to be part of those meetings the week of the February 1st. as soon as the chairman releases his version prior to the markup, we need to study it. We need to see what's in there. We need to really get clear about what our top priorities will be for those last weeks of trying to push for changes. Obviously, it will be tough for us to push for 1,500 pages of changes. So we're gonna try to, prioritize. For us, the FLUM, the future land use map, is really critical. It's, I've been working with Ivy City residents for almost 20 years. To have these types of changes just snuck into the comp plan without, these developers ever speaking to residents that live across the street is just terrible. And, council members like Kenyon McDuffie need to be opposing that. We've reached out to him and he has not told us yet his perspective on that. So we'll be counting on you all to echo those concerns. And then, as we get through this markup, which, like I said, we're expecting towards the end of February, and then there'll be 2 hearings, right? There'll be the first reading and the second reading, and there'll be a lot of debate among the council between those 2. I think it should be 2 weeks apart. We just need to stay really active on it, tweeting about it, calling your council members, emailing your council members. Don't feel like you need to know everything. Just call into question what's happening. How is this going to stop displacement? How is this going to increase low-income housing? How is this going to ensure that our community is at the front end of planning and decision-making? Is there any questions in the chat, Caitlin? And also would love to hear if there are people working on amendments. We'd love to hear what you're doing so that we can also incorporate it in what we are pushing for.
Thanks. I know a lot of people are overwhelmed by the amount of information that we have just dropped, and I appreciate that. We will share out all of the documents, the links. I've been pulling the links that people posted in the chat, so we will send all of that out. This is, as I always say, when I'm on here, it's like a beautiful space. I love to see over 100 people on a sunny Saturday still doing this 3 years in, almost 4 years in from when this group originally started. So thank you all for being here. I've been trying to pull questions. There's a lot, and they kind of are a range of them. So one of them, I'll try to summarize some if I can. One was basically, how do we, and this is from Ms. High. So Ms. High has been dropping stuff in about Park Morton, and just basically talking about how do we hold elected officials accountable right now? How do we hold Mendelson accountable and council and the mayor for basically owning up to the rhetoric, claiming Black Lives Matter, but if it's not happening in practice, how do we do that during this time? And one of her specific questions too was, how do we buy up public housing before DCHA sells it to developers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question for all of us. How do we hold our elected officials accountable? And that's something that we have to come up with some new strategies around, considering, we can't necessarily do the same rallies that we've done in the past, or, go pack the council office or do a sit-in in their office or any of those things. So we have to be more creative. And if people have ideas, please put them in the chat or, get them to us. We would love to figure out additional ways outside of just calls and emails. But I do have to say that I believe that the calls and emails are important. I spoke with Phil Mendelson's staff person, Julia Coster, earlier this week, and she noted that the emails that she got were, noticeable. And she even indicated that she felt like the majority of the comments were on our side. And that's because in addition to you all coming to those hearings, many of you sent the email when we put out the email alert. That really helped, that we were able to generate, I think it was, about 125 additional emails from that. And on the how do we get ahead of the housing issues with public housing? That's a big discussion. I think we should have a meeting just focused on those strategies. Right now, we're trying to get through the comp plan because it's coming up to a vote, but then we really want to turn to forward-thinking, proactive housing policy ideas. And that's the type of thing that we want to be working on as we get, to March or April after the comp plan. Caitlin, any other?
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion. Well, we probably won't get to these questions because I know that they were for Pam, but I just wanted to raise that a few folks, Laura Richards and Dominic, had talked about workforce development and how that played into the developments happening at the Sheridan. So I just wanted to highlight that. I know Reggie talked about some economic development amendments when he gave his presentation. So I'm not sure if we can answer that just in terms of like the workforce development component of those affordable housing developments, or if that may be something we answer later.
I'm happy to talk about it.
Oh, great. Thanks, Pam.
Yeah. And yeah, so the company I used to work for created the Skyline Workforce Center in part because they were doing a number of developments east of the river. And what they did was they created this space and brought in Department of Employment Services, as well as a number of nonprofits to help in workforce development. So if someone wanted to get a GED and or if someone wanted to get, some certification in, electric or plumbing or something like that, all having those opportunities in kind of like a one-stop shop. And so that is a great resource. And, as of the first year, they were able to place over 600 walk-ins into paid positions. And so, to the extent that other developers can replicate that in their communities that they're working in, it's easy to do. It's not easy work to do in the sense that it does take coordination and partnerships and collaboration and so forth, but so worthwhile. So it's a model that can be replicated. It does require investment, but it pays, benefits beyond measure. So so that I think that workforce center was built after the Sheridan station. So the Sheridan station I mentioned in that first phase, placing the 85 residents in jobs within the construction and property management field was something we were able to achieve. But it's something that developers that receive HUD funding have to track and report to and have benchmarks to comply with. So something that anyone on this call can ask a developer, where are you on your resident hiring, and hold them accountable and have those discussions, and not just in the beginning, but at the end of the job is something I encourage, everyone on this call who's interested in development to pursue on their respective communities.
Thanks, Pam. And Duan, I saw your additional comment in there too. I think that's just in the interest of time. I agree with you. Like, we definitely do need to continue having this conversation in terms of what job training programs we are producing and what jobs are available, and like how we make sure that people can continue to build wealth. So I agree with that as well, but thank you, Pam, for answering that. So the other conversation that I wanted to highlight, Parisa, is about taxes. And someone was asking, how do we strategize to leverage our taxes to make sure that our tax dollars are not going to development projects that are harmful? And I apologize, I'm paraphrasing what was said, but there's kind of an interesting discussion around how to use taxes and leverage our tax dollars in order to accomplish our goals.
Well, that I think is going to be a big issue as we move into the budget. So, we're getting into the council oversight and budget hearings. I know a major priority of DC Fiscal Policy Institute this year is to address revenue strategies, because we expect that that the council and the mayor will attempt to cut certain programs, saying that we have less money right now because of COVID. So that's where I think we can really raise those issues of how our tax dollars are spent, both increasing revenue from new sources, or for instance on higher income residents who can afford to pay more, but also more directly earmarking some of those funds. And perhaps we can have a follow-up discussion specifically about revenue at one of our upcoming meetings and talk about that, the tax issue.
Great. And then the one potentially final question is, and we kind of addressed this earlier in the presentation, but how do people work if their ANC is not on the same side that they are in terms of this issue? What can people do to kind of counteract that?
I think, you know, there's no shortcut to organizing. So you can let your neighbors know what you think about it. You can find other neighbors who share your perspective. You can make sure that your voices are heard at those meetings. You can, you know, push your ANC to create a committee. There are some committees, some ANCs that have like a development committee, development review committee, and, you know, push to have one of those and to have residents like yourself on it, so that you can be in the room as these decisions, you know, as these proposals are coming forward. And then ultimately, you may need to run against them or replace them. But I think there's, yeah, like I said, there's no substitute to organizing. So you know, talking to people, being public about it, sending out emails that question that person's position. And we have, we only have 1 minute, and we do have to close at 3 because we have another meeting at 3. So I'm gonna have to leave it there, but I think that that's a great another one that we can have a continuing conversation around and share ideas with each other. Especially one of the parts of the vision of this group, the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition, is that we will become the foot soldiers on the front lines of fighting displacement and gentrification, because we will be informed about all the decision-making processes around development, and we'll be able to start on our block, at our ANC, at our civic association, you know, at the front end, and not just at the back end when these developments are coming through the zoning commission. I want to invite everybody to unmute and say goodbye to each other. I want to thank you for being with us today. And just remember, if you could, just remember, we have to oppose those flum changes. If those flum changes go through, pretty much everything else that is said in the comp plan is going to have less effect, because they'll already have the density that they're trying to get. So everybody say hello and goodbye to each other. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Good to see you.
Faces. We'll send that follow-up meeting.
Au
That
revoir.
follow-up email.
Okay. Bye.
Appreciate all of you.
Meeting.
Thank you.
Great job to all
you.
our presenters.
Great job.
Great job.
Excellent job.
Great.
Be
So
great
much.
today, y'all.
Bye.
Have a
Bye.
wonderful
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Only.
All right, all right. And keep the faith.
That's right.